Stories of the past, roots and tradition, memories are cast in an Appalachian reunion. A taste of heritage, screen porch suppers, tales tall as a mountain ridge as we go deeper in the holler.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Appalachian Tale podcast. I'm Jimmy Proffitt, your host, and today is another solo episode. This one was a little bit late because I had something really fun happen last week, and I just didn't get around to getting the episode that I really wanted out done. I tried something, but it just didn't work. So anyway, I'm starting over again with this one, and sorry if you were expecting one last week and this is a little late, but I think you're going to enjoy it. So the middle of last week, I had the opportunity to meet the cast of the Waltons, the Walton TV show. I don't know if you all know who the Waltons were. If you're of my era, you definitely knew who the Waltons were, especially if you grew up in Virginia like me, you knew who the Waltons were because they were your people. You were their people. I mean, you knew who they were, and there wasn't anybody on the show that you didn't already know. You knew somebody like that person. And so it was a really incredible opportunity. They came to Pigeon Forge for a Waltons Weekend of the Smokies, and I knew they were coming. I'd heard they were going to be having a get-together, an event there, and I reached out to the organization that was planning all of it months ago to see if maybe I could set up a booth if they're going to have our vendors, if they're going to have anybody there selling things, maybe I could set up and sell my book. I thought, my book, Seasoned in Appalachia, would fit perfectly with the Waltons themselves. And so I reached out and found out they weren't going to have vendors like that there, and that's okay. I looked at getting some tickets, but I had to work. So, I thought, well, maybe by chance they'll be around and I'll get to see them. And there were some conversations with the production company, but nothing really set in concrete or stone, as they say, nothing set in stone. And so I didn't really know. Time passed, and sure enough, they showed up. They were at the mill, and they came by to have breakfast. There were 6 of them, the 3 original daughters, one of the sons, and then his TV wife, along with some of their family members, came, and they had breakfast one morning. And so part of my job is to take care of PR. And so I had the opportunity to go over and greet them, say hello, welcome them, and just talk to them for a minute and talk to them about, growing up in Virginia myself and being a big fan, and how it just felt like everybody on the show felt like somebody that we knew. And come to find out that some of the cast members had ties back to Virginia. And there's somebody that has family in a town where my mom grew up and where my grandma lived. And I was back there for book signings for my book as soon as it came out. It was the very first weekend I was back there. And that was Mary McDonough, who played Erin on the show, Erin Walton. And then Elizabeth Walton, played by Cammie Cotler, she actually, after the show, got her degree in education, and she went back to Nelson County, where the original writer of the show, Earl Hamner Jr., where he grew up, and where the setting of the show was supposed to be. So it was in the mountains of Virginia. Where he grew up, it was Schuyler, Virginia. But of course, on the show, it was Walton's Mountain. And there were lots of ridges and mountains and things all around where he grew up. But I think for the show, he made it a little bit bigger, and that's how it became Walton's Mountain. So it's just really a fun opportunity. I got to talk to them, got to know them a little bit. I gave them a tour of the mill. And because we had talked about things in Virginia in my book, so I let them go and eat their breakfast, and I went back and I got some books. I happened to keep them in my car because, I'll have events, and so that's important for me to have those handy anytime I need. And so I got them some books, and I signed them, and I took them back over and waited for them to come down from breakfast and gave them a tour of the mill. And it was really fun because Eric Scott, who played Ben Walton, was one of the sons that was there with his wife, his real life wife, Cindy, and his TV wife, who was played by Leslie Winston, I believe. And her name on the show was Cindy. But anyway, I got to talk to them a little bit. And he was saying that being inside the mill was a lot like being inside the sawmill on the show, the sawmill that they had. That was the family business, was the sawmill. That's what got them through the Depression era in the show's timeline and storyline. And then we were talking about the different types of corn and how we grind popcorn. And he grew popcorn a few years ago and really enjoyed doing it. So even though he wasn't a Walton, he was, I guess, living a little bit like a Walton would have, like a good Appalachian would have, grown your own food and things like that. It was just so much fun. And it's honestly, it was an opportunity of a lifetime. I never really thought something like that would happen. I mean, it was just very surreal to see them, and I could see them as they were in characters on the show. I don't think that they've really changed that much, but of course they were themselves and not so much the character that they played on the show. But to see them and look at them, to me, they still look very much like those characters. Like, again, it was somebody that I would have known when I was a kid, and now I know now here in, well, we're going to say midlife. But those of you that don't know what the Waltons were, it was a TV show about a family that was making it through the Depression and in through the era of World War II in the mountains of Virginia, in rural Virginia. And so I'm just going to give you a rundown of some of the characters on the show and talk to you about how those were people that I really, like I said, I knew that there were people in my community that were just like them. There was John Walton Sr., and he was daddy on the show. He was the hardworking father of the Walton family that ran the family sawmill that he took over from his father, and I'll talk about him a little bit. But that got him through the Great Depression, through grit and honesty and sacrifice. He always made things work. And, but he was, he would get his temper up every now and then, but for the most part, he was quiet and he was wise and he was really devoted to Olivia, his wife, and all the kids. And so everything always came back to a central point every night. And we'll talk about that, or at the end of every episode, we'll talk about that a little bit. I mentioned Olivia. So there was Olivia Walton. That was Mama on the show. And she was really the heart of the Walton home. She was gentle. She was faithful. So you always knew she was religious and spiritual, but not overly, as a lot of people were in Appalachia. They weren't, not to be political, but you didn't hear of any Christian right or left or center, or people just went to church. And they were godly and faithful and compassionate about their neighbors and their family. And so she brought a lot of strength and tenderness to the show. And she kept everybody grounded spiritually and emotionally, especially through difficult times. And that's what a mom does. That's what a mama does. And then, of course, there was John Boy Walton. He was the oldest of all the kids. And there were 7 kids altogether. And even though he was really, I think, in the timeline of the show, in the storyline, he was really a year or two older than everybody, than the next one, and then, one down the line, Elizabeth being the youngest, and I think she was probably 6. So there was probably a 10 to 11 year span of those 7 children. So again, not that much older than everybody else, but he seemed like another parent to the kids, which is again something that happens a lot in families in Appalachia. I remember hearing Dolly talk about that, and how with each new child that was born in the family, and there were even more of them, each one was born, somebody in the family was given charge of them. So they would say that was their baby. So it may be, someone that was 4 or 5 years younger than them, but that got to be their baby. And that meant that they were going to look out for them for the rest of their lives. So they all got to play the big brother, big sister to some degree, except of course the youngest ones didn't, but they got to play the family. They got to play the baby in the family. But anyway, so John Boy Walton, being the eldest, was really there to look after everybody. And he was modeled after the writer of the show, Earl Hamner Jr. And in the show, of course, he, just like Earl Hamner, dreamed of becoming a writer. The whole time he was always documenting what the family was doing on Walton's Mountain. So the whole thing was almost like a diary being written and read out loud by John Boy Walton throughout the show. And then there was Jason Walton. He was musically inclined and he was gifted. And I think on the show he played the piano. I think he played the guitar. I actually saw him in concert in the late 80s. So it was after the show ended. Several years after the show ended, I went to a concert in Washington, D.C., and he was in the band for Richard Marx. And he was introduced as the guy that played Jason Walton. And so that was kind of neat to get to see somebody all those years ago when it was still pretty fresh. I mean, it was definitely in reruns at that point. Wasn't in the first run, but we watched the reruns a lot. And I saw more in reruns than I did in the first run, because the show started, I think, in 1971. So I would have been going on 3 years old. So I wouldn't have remembered those first few years anyway, but I definitely saw all the episodes later in reruns for sure. Jason was often quieter and more introspective. You didn't really hear a whole lot about him, but he had sort of that musical personality that he was always thinking and taking everything in internally. Then there was Mary Ellen Walton. She was the oldest daughter on the show, and she was very independent, very spirited. She was a tomboy starting out, but then she ended up being a lot more motherly as the show went on. But in the very beginning, she was very much a tomboy and would give her brothers a run for their money. And later she became interested in medicine and even becoming a nurse and wanting to become a doctor. I can't remember if in the run of the show she became a doctor. I think later when they did some reruns or not reruns, when they did some reunion shows, reunion movies after the run of the show ended on into the late 80s. I think in some of those she was a doctor at that point. They were on Walton's Mountain. And, that was pretty unique for a woman of that era, because then you're talking about getting into the 50s and 60s, while this show itself was running through the 30s and 40s. There was Erin Walton, and she in the show was very soft-spoken and just sort of known for her romantic outlook on life. And I don't want to say she was considered the beauty of the family, but probably a little more of a beauty, where Mary Ellen was very much a tomboy and Elizabeth was still just a little kid through most of it. Wouldn't have been thought of in any way other than that for the most part. But she always represented like grace and sensitivity in the family. Then there was Ben Walton, and he was the middle, well, not really the middle son, but one of the middle sons, but again, kind of almost like the oldest, since John Boy was more like a parent in the kids line. But Ben was strong-willed. He and his dad could have some fights throughout the episodes, and he was adventurous and maybe a little rebellious. I think one of the storylines later in the series, he came home and he had a wife, and I don't think anybody knew. And so that would be the woman that would play Cindy Walton in the show that I also got to meet. But he did a lot of work like his dad did. So he was very physical and was very serious about work. And then there was Jim Bob Walton, and he was more of the tinkerer. He would play around with cars and planes and that kind of thing. So he was always tinkering with something on the show and building. And I think he dreamed of becoming a pilot in the series. And then, of course, the youngest being Elizabeth Walton. And like I said, I think beginning of the show, she was like 6 years old, and she was probably 16 when it ended in the show. So she was still, I believe, in high school or about to graduate high school in the show itself. But being the youngest, she was the sweetest, most imaginative. She had an outlook on life different from everybody else. And she brought a lot of innocence and wonder to the show. And so looking at all those characters, I mean, definitely I knew people that were like the mother and the father. My oldest brother was probably a bit like John Boy in that he was looking out for all of us, being the extra parent. That was kind of his job. And my brother Pat was always tinkering with cars, always, still does to this day. So there was that. But my brother Bobby was probably more like Jim Bob, looking like Jim Bob, I should say, then and now, even the character or the actor that played Jim Bob. But he also tinkered with things, but he was probably more quiet than everybody else. But Pat was definitely the one that was tinkering with engines all the time, and Ricky did too. But so all those kids seemed familiar. And of course there were girls in the neighborhood that would remind me of all the Walton's girls. And, if they were hanging around us, then somebody was going to be a tomboy with all of us boys. But my favorite character on the show was probably Grandpa Walton, and his name was Zebulon Walton, and a very old, almost biblical name. And he was just a big, gruff, kind of burly guy, but he was really soft and tender. He was humorous. He was stubborn. He was lovable. He was a storyteller. So maybe I'm a bit like Grandpa. And he loved fishing and homemade remedies. If there was anybody on Walton's Mountain that was like the granny witch or the mountain witch, it was going to be Grandpa Walton. He knew all the plants and what they could do. He could tell you all the stories of the mountains and the weather lore. He knew what was happening before it was going to happen. But he was the head of the family for sure. And so Grandpa was probably my favorite of all the characters. And then maybe next to that was Grandma, and that was Esther Walton. And she was sharp-tongued. She could tell you what it was in a flat second. And that was a lot like my Grandma Barton. She didn't mince words. I mean, as she would say, she would call the kettle black. And so being sharp tongued and just kind of fierce and little, I mean, she's just not imposing at all. You just look at her and you think she's just a little old woman, but yeah, she could hold her own, especially against Grandpa. And she just kind of ran the kitchen a little bit. She let Mama, Olivia, run her kitchen, but she was there to make sure that that nobody got out of line. So she was always teaching the kids and being an extra hand there with raising all them. And my favorite line of everything was when she would call Grandpa an old poop. And I just thought that was funny. I don't know. And like I said, she was a lot probably like my grandma Martin. And as far as Grandpa, I don't, like I said, maybe me, that's kind of, when I get old, that's who I'm going to be. And then there was Ike and Corabeth Godsey that ran the store, Godsey's store. And we had Markley's store growing up. That was an old country store not far from, it was within a mile of the house. And we'd walk there all the time. We probably walked barefooted, just like the Waltons kids did we didn't have a gravel road. We walked the railroad tracks a lot to go to Markley's store, but the neighbors would send us all the time up to Markley's, even though it was south, but we'd say we're going up to Markley's. And so there was a husband and wife that ran Markley's store. And in the show, Ike was the shopkeep that you saw out front all the time and dealing with all the customers. But then there was Corabeth Walton Godsey. She was a distant cousin to the Waltons. She brought an air of sophistication to the show, and not really better than everybody else, but she could walk that line of being in both worlds, of being a little more refined, but also she was a Walton. So her family line went back on that mountain for generations. And then Mrs. Markley, that of Markley's store, she was a lot more like Corabeth, that she ran the business end of things, but she was out with the customers a lot. But she ran a tight ship. She was always a little intimidating and always wore dresses every day. I never saw her in anything but a dress. And we're talking 30, 40 years after the timeline of the Waltons, which was 30s to 40s. And now I'm talking 70s and 80s. She was still wearing a dress every single day. And so parts were maybe a little combination of Ike too. And then you get into the Baldwin sisters, and oh my gosh, if you have not watched the show, do it just for the Baldwin sisters, because they're two old spinster ladies that live in their dad's old, it appears to be like a Civil War era mansion, that they're still trying to keep up the mansion, and being at their age, I think they would remember the Civil War, because that would have been 60 years prior to that run of the show, and they probably were supposed to be in their 70s and 80s. So I think their dad was Papa, as they called him, was supposedly served in the war, but his story and their story was the recipe. And so even though they were two little old spinster ladies, they were moonshiners, and they made hooch. But they didn't call it hooch. They called it the recipe, Papa's recipe. And for them, it was purely medicinal. They didn't think of it any other way, and would never even begin to infer that it was anything other than medicinal, even though everybody in Walton's Mountain knew what it was for. Olivia Walton wouldn't have anything to do with bringing that stuff into her house, and she would call John out if he brought some in. That's what I just loved about the Baldwin sisters, is that they were these characters that were it's like two different sides of a coin, and what they were doing. So innocent, but doing something, really, I mean, completely against the law. And they never got caught. Nobody ever did anything about it. It didn't matter. If there was any episodes of the show where they got caught, it didn't last long, and I don't think anybody would have believed it. I don't know. And I don't even remember how many episodes there were, but I've probably seen them all. And then there were, of course, the reunion shows that I mentioned, that they would come back. I think one of the last ones, I'm trying to remember, I think it was probably around the late 60s. It was 69, actually, just before my birthday was the timeline. I was born in June of 69. So yeah, I got a birthday coming up pretty soon. Uh, a month, or no, not before my birthday, a month after my birthday was the first landing on the moon. And I think John Boy Walton came back right around that time, and was struggling with his writing, and he was a big newspaper man in New York, I think, at this time or something. And anyway, it was about how incredible it was that people were landing on the moon. And I think at this time, instead of everybody gathering around the radio like they did on the show all the time to hear the news, and that was their entertainment in the evening. Grandma and Grandpa would get in their rocking chairs and sit there, and everybody looked at the radio, even though they couldn't see anything, but everybody looked at the radio, which is what everybody did. They sat around and that was their entertainment before TVs came along. But I think definitely in the reunion shows, by that time they had a TV and they could see the moon landing and things like that. So it was really interesting how they brought that on up through the years. And if you look back at the timeline, not sure it all would have really matched up, considering that would have been 25 to 30 years later and people hadn't aged quite that much. The actor Will Greer that played Grandpa passed away, I think, in season 5 or 6 of the show. So he was already gone. John Boy left the show at some point. Olivia Walton left the show at some point. The actors, and their names will come to me in just a minute, I'm sure. I'm getting a lot like Grandpa. My memory's going. But so there were actors that left the show throughout the seasons, whether, by death or because that's what they wanted to do. It was time to move on. But Ellen Corby that played Grandma, she had a stroke during the run of the show and was determined to come back and keep playing that character. And she did. That was part of the storyline they made in the show. And I thought that was pretty courageous of her to do that. And again, just played right into the grandma character, that she was just fierce and determined and strong-willed, and nothing was going to get her down. She was there in 1969, and she would have been, we're talking again 30 years later, based on the show, she would have easily been 100 years old. So they may have stretched the got a little creative in some of those reunion shows, but nonetheless. But it all started with a movie called The Homecoming that came out a couple of years before the series started. So that was one of my mom's favorite movies. And, back then, yes, things were in reruns, but you couldn't just call something up whenever you wanted to stream it or run to the store and rent it. Not back then. That didn't exist. For you youngins, that did not exist. We couldn't look anything up on a computer because we didn't have one. There wasn't one. DVDs and VHSs were not around. That didn't exist. We didn't have any way to record any TV. So you watched it when it came back on. And so a couple of times we watched The Homecoming. And now at Christmas, I like to get on my computer and stream it and sit down and watch it. And when I do, the last time I did it, I decided I was going to make Olivia Walton's applesauce cake. And so, on this podcast, I like to ask the guest a couple of things or talk about a couple of things. And one of them would be, if I invited you to a screen porch supper, what would you bring? So if I invited the Waltons, and maybe one day I'll get to do that, we'll see. If I do, I will let you know if I get to invite the Waltons to a screen porch supper here at our house. Virtually, if we have a screen porch supper and the Waltons come, I hope they bring Olivia Walton's applesauce cake. And it is really good. My grandma Barton made an applesauce cake, and I didn't think it was that good. My mom loved it, but I've made Olivia Walton's, and it's pretty good. And that's actually Earl Hamner Jr.'s mom's recipe. He had that in the novel called The Homecoming that was then turned into the movie. And so I think that's what I would want them to bring. And also ask them, what would be your favorite Appalachian word or phrase? And, they had lots of words and phrases they used on the show. And some of them I use today. I don't know if that's where I learned it. I hadn't really thought about it till I kind of started researching this a little bit. Maybe that's where I learned some of these words. But reckon. You reckon we should head home now? I reckon we should do this or do that. That probably would have been Grandpa. And I use reckon a lot. Youngins. I'm sure I know that Mama and Grandma said those an awful lot. And you youngins get in here, and John, what are we going to do? Those youngins are out there in the storm or whatever, study on it, meaning to read up on it, to think about it. That would have been a John Boy Walton Appalachian phrase for sure. Fixin' to. All the boys were fixin' to fix something, fixin' to get to work. I'm fixin' to, Daddy. I'm fixin' to. And so that just meant they were going to get to it. They were headed there. They were about to do it. Took poorly, Grandpa took poorly when that fallen star came to Walton's Mountain. Grandpa took poorly. And that would have been probably Daddy. That would have been John Walton that would have said that. And Mike could. That's probably a Mary Ellen Appalachian word right there. I can hear the character of Mary Ellen saying that. And those are just some. And those are things that I say, and I know other people that say them. Mike could is something that that my friend Landon Bryant says all the time. And by the way, I'm going to have an episode coming up soon with him. So a little teaser there. I hope to get to see him this week and we can record something soon. He says Mike could all the time. That's one of the words that really kind of got him to take off on social media. But I just thought, that could be where I learned or it reinforced some of these Appalachian words or phrases that I grew up just hearing and knowing all my life. Other ways that it all tied into my family and why they felt like people I knew. My grandparents lived in Scottsville, Virginia, which on a map was really only about 20 miles from Schuyler, Virginia, where Earl Hamner Jr. grew up, which was the setting of Walton's Mountain. And so I remember going to that house. It was one of my favorite houses that they ever lived in. Granddaddy, if I hadn't said before, was a Methodist minister. So they moved around a lot, but they were in Scottsville for a number of years when I was probably Elizabeth's age. And during that same, it just made it feel even more like home. And they would mention some of the counties in Virginia that I knew, like Albemarle County, I think was probably mentioned. And that was the county my grandparents lived in. It was the next county over from Nelson, where the show was set. And when I was talking to them, being able to mention some of those places and they knew them. Like I said, Cammie Kotler that played Elizabeth Walton, when she went back to Nelson County to teach, she knew where Scottsville was. She was very familiar with it. And she did that for a number of years before finally moving back to California. She said she was born in California, born and raised there to be closer to family. And now I think they all tour, not all the time, but they tour quite often as the Waltons. And so I'm hoping that this weekend was really good for them. And that means that they'll come back, and getting to give each one of them a copy of my book and sign it personally to them was just, it was a thrill. It was an absolute thrill. And I want to get addresses, at least for the other actors that played Jason and Jim Bob, because they weren't at breakfast, but they were there for the event. So I want to try and get addresses to send them books as well. And I think we're going to send them all some stuff that they saw at the mill, just so they can remember us. But I hope they want to come back. And when they do, I get to know them better. Hey, maybe one day I can be an honorary Walton, and that would be pretty cool. So this is about the time that the music would play off in the show, and everybody would start the signature Goodnight. So I'm going to say Goodnight, podcast. Well, friends, that's it for today. Thank you for listening to the Appalachian Tale podcast. I'm your host, Jimmy Proffitt. This podcast is recorded in Greenhouse Studio right here in my backyard and produced and edited by me with a little help and a lot of encouragement from my husband, Mick. You might know him as Mick on the Porch. If you've enjoyed today's episode, like, rate, and comment, and share it with someone who appreciates a good story, good food, and a little bit of Appalachia. I'll talk at you later. Y'all be safe, and let me know you got home okay.